spooky Callisto protocol begins, like all good prison movies, with an unbearable sense of doom and gloom. Working man pilot Jacob Lee has crashed on the dead moon Callisto after his cargo ship is cornered by a notorious terrorist group and promptly arrested, before a mysterious disaster sends the residents of the Black Iron Prison into crazed mutants. Turns the Callisto protocol wastes no time in cementing the horror of its setting. Now all we've to do is run and slaughter our way through the mostly straightforward corridors for 15 hours. The first few hours have it all: claustrophobic rooms with bubbling valves and sparking wires, aged steel access holes, echoing ventilation shafts, flickering holographic terminals in crawl spaces full of slimy filth, but by the end of the game there are some surprising departures from grim dark corridor is the Dead Space 4 or the Dead Space 3 that many think should have been. Pretty much both. The director of the Callisto Protocol is Glenn Schofield, who directed the first two Dead Space games, and he's taken the game's polished balance between powerful and yet oh so vulnerable, and it actually feels like Dead Space, especially Dead Space 2, one of my favorite games, to the point where it even takes some scenes directly from that game. It took a few hours to master the largely simple dodging system, but when it comes to the actual beating, it's satisfyingly vicious, especially when he's being shot at with buckshot at close range. Lee has a glowing green bar on the back of his head to indicate his health, and another blue one to indicate if his grip is overheating. The grip is Callisto Protocol's answer to Levitate's controls, or Half-Life 2's gravity gun, or the kinesis module that lets you throw objects at enemies, or as a new addition, pick them up and hurl them into an alarming mountain of wall-mounted spikes that, on Moon Colony. This issue of a delete button in survival horror is confusing at first, but the game gradually compensates for this after I forgot the handle. It took a while, but once I learned to go into any combat situation with some alertness to the dangers of the environment, the game's approach to combat clicked. I don't find any of the saliva-covered baddies particularly terrifying, if only because I've played plenty of horror games with such foes, but there are a few lows and predators that are the exception. It's not the look of these scary mutants that's threatening, but the way they move around the environments. There's also the constant threat of them transforming into something scarier if you don't shoot the tentacles off a mutant. I often spent 5 minutes selling loot and upgrading weapons at a workstation, only to die shortly after and have to perform the transaction again. I died a lot in the second half of the game, but at least there was some nauseating novelty in the form of a new death scene. These repeat, of course, with some being retained from the middle to the end of the game, but there are many of them and they're surprisingly disgusting. Macabre. Since this is a roller coaster video game riddles with cinematic video game cliches in a lot of ways, the Callisto Protocol feels like a new albeit well-qualified studio singing to the crowd, and it's safe to bet that the crowd will keep singing along. In terms of performance, with a 3080 it ran below 60 frames per second with ray tracing on, but then jumped to about 100 as soon as I turned it off. Setting FSR 2.0 to performance mode gave me a whole extra 3.5 FPS, and no other settings made any noticeable difference. Even after that, there was definitely some jitter, especially in the moments when camera control is taken away or returned, on both sides of certain pre. A big part of me wishes a blockbuster horror game would break the mold a little, as many people hoped Kojima would with Silent Hills, but it's hard to fault Callisto Protocol for achieving exactly what it set out to do: an immersive, linear sci-fi survival horror that tells its own story. Survival horror that spins its dystopian yarn around dozens of stressful encounters. You wish everything would become clear soon, the truth about Black Island.